This is Samuel, and it was here, kneeling on the cold grass of Liberty Square, that he was handcuffed for a crime he did not commit, the crime of praying. That public humiliation, with the cold metal on his wrists marking the end of a dream, was just the beginning of his ordeal. The faith that sustained him became the weapon used against him. Has your faith ever been tested in this way, to the point where it seemed that God himself had fallen silent? Before I tell you how God acted in his life, at the exact moment the system tried to crush him because of a prayer, comment here where you are watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when we place things in his hands, even when the whole world seems to condemn us. The approach was swift, brutal. 2 police officers with stern faces and the impatience of those dealing with something dirty surrounded him. One of them lightly kicked the toe of his boot, a gesture of contempt that cut through the silence of his prayer. "What do you think you're doing?" The question came heavy with accusation. Samuel, still dazed, raised a serene gaze, trying to understand. He saw no threat, only men doing their duty, but the energy was hostile, aggressive. The anonymous tip spoke of suspicious and threatening behavior, words that made no sense to the man whose only act was to talk to his father on a patch of grass he cared for so lovingly every day. Injustice was beginning to take shape in strong, cruel strokes. He tried to explain in his still hesitant English that he was just on his lunch break saying his daily prayer. It was a sacred ritual, his only bridge to Luanda, to the memory of his wife, and to the hope he nurtured for his children. Prayer was his sustenance, more important than the bread in his lunchbox, but his words were lost in the heavy air of suspicion. To those men, he was not a family man, a worker, a man of faith. He was just a foreign body, a black immigrant. In a place where his presence, especially in an act of vulnerability like prayer, was seen as a dangerous anomaly. Prejudice did not need words to manifest itself. It was in the stares, in the posture, in the refusal to listen. The request for his documents was the next blow. Samuel handed them over with trembling hands, not out of fear of the law, but from the consuming embarrassment. He knew there was a small issue with his work visa, a bureaucratic detail his lawyer was already resolving. It was a matter of time, of paperwork, but at that moment, under the midday sun and the curious gazes that were beginning to gather, that small irregularity became the perfect excuse. The officer smiled from the corner of his mouth, a victorious smirk. They had found what they were looking for. The prayer, the square, the complaint didn't matter. That piece of paper was his condemnation. The system's trap, always ready to snap shut on the most fragile, had just been sprung. The handcuffs clicked on, his wrists with a metallic, definitive sound. It was a sound that echoed louder than the city's noise, a sound that seemed to seal his fate. All around, dozens of people stopped to watch. Some with pity, others with indifference, many with their cell phones raised, recording his shame for the rapid consumption of social media. Samuel felt his face burn. He, who had always walked with his head held high, who taught his children the value of dignity, was being treated like a common criminal in the middle of the square he helped to make bloom. It was the deepest humiliation of his life. He was no longer Samuel, the Angolan gardener. He was just a spectacle, a problem being removed from public view. Inside the patrol car, the silence was oppressive. The smell of disinfectant and the cold plastic of the seat seemed to suck all the air from his lungs. Through the window, he saw the city pass by like a blur. The same streets that once represented hope and opportunity now seemed like the bars of a moving prison. He closed his eyes, and instead of anger or despair, a silent prayer welled up in his heart. It was not a plea for deliverance, but a plea for strength. "Lord, do not let me falter. Do not let me lose faith in you, even if I don't understand why this is happening. Be with me." It was an intimate conversation, a thread of light in the darkness that was swallowing him. He clung to this connection like a castaway clings to a piece of wood. At the police station, the dehumanization continued. He was processed like a piece on an assembly line. Photos, fingerprints, questions asked mechanically and impatiently. The language barrier isolated him even more. Every "what" he uttered was met with an irritated sigh. He felt the eyes on him judging his accent, his color, his very existence in that place. No one cared about his story, about the fact that he was a widower trying to give his children a future. Inside, he was just an incident report, a case number. The system, cold and impersonal, had no face, no heart. And Samuel was being ground down by its gears. The confirmation that he would be transferred to immigration custody and that a deportation process would be initiated was the news that turned fear into terror. Deportation. The word sounded like a death sentence for his dreams. To return to Angola, empty-handed, defeated, humiliated. To leave his children without the future he was sacrificing everything for. The image of their faces, full of expectation and pride, appeared in his mind, and a sharp pain shot through his chest. It was an unbearable weight. There, in that cold, grey room, under the fluorescent lights that seemed to suck all life, Samuel's faith was truly put to the test. He wondered for the first time if God had abandoned him. His one phone call was to the pastor of his small church, a refuge for African and Caribbean immigrants in a distant suburb. Pastor Jonas's voice, calm and steady on the other end of the line, was the first breath of fresh air in hours. He made no empty promises, offered no magical solutions. He simply said, "Samuel, my brother, you are not alone. Our community is with you. We will pray without ceasing. Hold on. God is in control." Those simple words, spoken with the authority of one who knows suffering and faith, were like a balm. They did not change the reality of his situation, but they lit a small candle of hope inside him, a reminder that his family in Christ would not let him be forgotten. The days that followed in detention were a blur of anxiety and prayer. The place was cold, not just in temperature, but in its soul. The grey walls seemed to absorb the hope of the men there, all sharing stories of interrupted dreams and distant families. Samuel heard whispers of fear, of anger, of resignation. He fought not to be contaminated by that despair. Every night when the lights went out, he would curl up on his bunk and pray. He didn't ask to be freed, but for his faith to be greater than those walls, greater than the fear that tried to suffocate him. He remembered Pastor Jonas and repeated to himself, "God is in control." It was his mantra, his anchor in the midst of the storm. The public defender assigned to him was a young woman with a weary look that revealed the weight of hundreds of cases like his. She met him in a tiny room, a pile of papers between them. Her name was Sarah, but she never introduced herself with warmth. To her, Samuel was case number 784B. She leafed through the documents with a cold efficiency, focusing only on the visa irregularity. "The prayer part is irrelevant to the court," she said, with a frankness that hurt. "They don't care about the why. They care about the fact that your status was not 100% regular." Samuel felt a lump in his throat. He was being reduced to a paperwork error, his humanity and his faith dismissed as unimportant details. He tried, in his gentle voice, to explain the context. He spoke of his work in the square, of his love for that small patch of green, of how prayer was his way of staying sane, of connecting with the strength that moved him to wake up every day so far from home. He wanted her to see him, to see the man behind the case number, but Sarah just shook her head, jotting something down on her notepad. "Mr. Santos, I understand, but legally, our only chance is to argue the unintentional nature of the visa violation and your good work history. The prayer story will just sound like an emotional appeal, and immigration judges hate that." With each of her words, Samuel's hope diminished a little more. He was in the hands of someone who did not understand the essence of who he was. While the legal system treated him with coldness, his church community moved with fervor. Pastor Jonas organized prayer vigils in front of the detention center. There were few people, a small group of immigrants holding candles and singing hymns in their native languages, but their faith was giant. They raised a small fund with what little money they had to help with any needs he might have. Javier, his Latino co-worker, managed to visit him once. He brought a note from his other colleagues, saying they missed him in the square. That simple gesture, that small proof that he was not invisible to everyone, gave Samuel immense strength. They were small miracles in the midst of the chaos, reminders that God worked through people. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. The journey to the courthouse was made in silence, inside a stuffy van, along with other men with the same lost look. Samuel looked through the barred window, seeing pieces of the city that he might never see again as a free man. He remembered the promise he made to his children in the last call before he was arrested. "Daddy is working hard so we can be together soon." The possibility of failing them was a physical pain, a pang in his chest that made him hold his breath. He asked God that, regardless of the outcome, he would give him the grace to accept his will. It was not resignation, but a deep surrender, the final act of trust from a son to his father. The courtroom was exactly as he had imagined, imposing, cold, and dominated by dark wood. The judge, a man with a stern face and graying hair, seemed tired and impatient. The prosecutor, in his impeccable suit, exuded a confidence that crushed any remnant of hope. Samuel sat next to his lawyer, feeling small and out of place. He looked at the American flag next to the judge and thought of the irony of being in the land of the free, about to be condemned for an act of faith. The atmosphere was charged with a soulless bureaucracy, where fates were decided with the same emotion one stamps any document. For them, it was just another Tuesday. For Samuel, it was Judgment Day. Sarah's defense was exactly as she had promised, technical, quick, and soulless. She spoke of deadlines, forms, of the non-criminal nature of the visa infraction. She presented letters of recommendation from his gardening supervisor, but she avoided at all costs mentioning the word prayer. She avoided talking about the prejudice, the false complaint, the public humiliation. She was playing the systems game, trying to win on a minefield where the rules were made for him to lose. Samuel listened to it all, and his heart sank. He saw the judge's bored expression and knew with a devastating certainty that this defense was not working. His truth, the whole truth, was not being told in that room. The judge flipped through the papers with an irritated quickness, barely looking at Samuel. His gestures conveyed a clear message. He had already made his decision. This was just a protocol to be followed before signing the deportation order. The prosecutor had already presented his case succinctly, painting Samuel as just another immigrant who disrespected the country's laws. The scales of justice seemed hopelessly tipped. Samuel felt the ground disappear from under his feet. This was it, the end of the line. He looked at his lawyer, who shrugged discreetly, a gesture of silent defeat. The silence in the room was heavy, dense, like the air before a storm. It was then that the judge, almost as an afterthought, addressed him for the first time. "Mr. Santos, do you have anything to say in your defense before I render my decision?" The question caught everyone by surprise, even his lawyer. It was a formality, but it opened a small window of opportunity. Everyone in the room expected the same thing, a tearful plea, a supplication for mercy, perhaps an outburst of anger against the injustice. Samuel's heart raced. The anger was there, bubbling beneath the surface, the urge to scream about the prejudice and humiliation. But another voice, calmer and older, spoke within him, the voice of his faith, which reminded him of who he was and in whom he trusted. With a calmness that surprised even himself, Samuel stood up. His legs trembled slightly, but his spine was straight. He did not look at the judge as a defendant, but as a man. His shoulders, once stooped by the weight of shame, were now straight, supported by a dignity that came from a place much deeper than that courtroom. He took a deep breath, feeling everyone's eyes on him, the impatient judges, the arrogant prosecutors, his resigned lawyers. In that instant, he was no longer alone. He felt the presence of God beside him, giving him the right words, not to win a legal battle, but to bear witness to the truth. The silence in the room became electric, full of expectation. His voice came out steady, with the slight melody of his Angolan accent filling the heavy silence of the court. "Your Honor," he began, with a respect that came not from fear, but from his upbringing. "On that day, in Liberty Square, I was not disturbing the peace." He paused, letting the words echo. "I was praying for it." His eyes met the judge's, not with defiance, but with a disarming sincerity. "I was praying for my family who are so far away. I was praying for this city, which welcomed me to work, and I was even praying for the people who do not understand me." The room remained in absolute silence. His lawyer looked at him, stunned. He had just torn up her script. He continued, and his voice, though choked with emotion, did not waver. "I am a gardener. My job is to cultivate beauty, but the greatest beauty I know comes from my faith. It is the root that keeps me standing. It is the water that sustains me when the sun is too strong." He gestured with his hands, the same hands that cared for the flowers in the square. "My visa had a problem, I know, and I was trying to fix it. But my real crime on that day was to kneel to speak with my God. My faith is all I have. If it is a crime to have faith in this country, then, Your Honor, I have no defense." As he finished, a deep and uncomfortable silence settled in. It was no longer an immigration case. Samuel had transformed it into a matter of conscience. The judge, for the first time, seemed genuinely shaken. His mask of impatience broke, giving way to an expression of deep reflection. He looked at Samuel, then at the papers on his desk, as if seeing them from a new perspective. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The narrative had changed. Samuel was no longer the illegal immigrant, but a man of faith being judged for his devotion. He had humanized the process, forcing everyone in that room to confront the true nature of the accusation. That moment of silence was the first crack in the wall of injustice, a breach through which light was beginning to enter. What no one in the courtroom knew was that thousands of miles away, a video was beginning to take on a life of its own on the internet. A European tourist, fascinated by the bustle of Liberty Square, was filming the urban landscape when, by chance, he captured the entire scene. He filmed Samuel on his knees, with an expression of deep peace on his face minutes before the police arrived. He filmed the truculent approach, the kick to his boot, the embarrassment of a man being interrupted in a sacred moment. The tourist, not fully understanding what was happening, posted the video with a simple caption, "Strange scene in Liberty Square today." He had no idea of the fire he was about to start. The algorithm, with its mysterious logic, began to push the video, first to small groups, then to larger pages. People did not see threatening behavior. They saw a black man, clearly a worker, praying peacefully and being treated with disproportionate aggression. The comments exploded. "Is this religious freedom?" asked one. "Since when is praying a crime?" said another. The image of Samuel's serene face contrasting with the hostility of the police was powerful, undeniable. The lie of the original complaint, which spoke of a threat, was being exposed for millions to see. The justice that was failing inside the courthouse began to manifest itself outside. A local journalist from a small investigative blog named Maria saw the video. Something in Samuel's calmness, even in the face of humiliation, touched her deeply. She was not particularly religious, but she recognized injustice when she saw it. Motivated by an instinct that went beyond the search for a scoop, she started digging. She found out Samuel's name, learned of his arrest and the deportation proceedings. She went further. She spent hours researching the city archives and found the law used to justify the approach in the square, an old municipal ordinance on vagrancy and disorderly conduct, created decades ago and historically used to suppress minority demonstrations. It was a racist, dusty law they had found to justify prejudice. Maria's article, titled "The Gardener Who Was Arrested for Praying," was published the following night. It not only told Samuel's story and showed the viral video, but also exposed the legal and discriminatory root of the police action. The article was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Within hours, it was replicated by major national news portals. The story exploded. Samuel's name was everywhere. The narrative was completely reversed. He was no longer an anonymous man facing deportation. He was the symbol of a glaring injustice. The man who reported him and the officers who arrested him, once figures of authority, were now seen as villains. The public, pressure on the city hall and the police department became overwhelming. Phones rang off the hook, email inboxes overflowed. Civil rights groups, churches of all denominations, and ordinary citizens demanded an answer. How could a city that prided itself on its diversity and freedom allow a man to be arrested for praying in public? Samuel's story touched a raw nerve in American society. The tense relationship between faith, race, and law, the small prayer of a lone gardener, had become a national debate. The square that had brought his name to humiliation was now the stage for protests in his favor. Inside the detention center, Samuel knew nothing of this. He lived in a vacuum, oblivious to the storm brewing in his name. His days remained the same, marked by uncertainty and prayer. He awaited the judge's decision, which, according to his lawyer, could take days or weeks. He prepared for the worst, trying to find peace in surrender. He did not know that his voice in the courtroom, combined with the image of his silent prayer, was moving mountains on the outside. God was working on a much bigger plan than Samuel could imagine, using technology and the conscience of strangers to weave his redemption. The judge was now in an impossible position. The case he intended to dispatch in 10 minutes had become a national hot potato. Thousands of letters and emails flooded his office, most of them quoting Samuel's own words in court. He could no longer ignore the moral and public context of the situation. His decision would not just be about a work visa, it would be a verdict on religious freedom and racial justice in his city. The calm and faith of a single man had put the entire system in check. The heavy silence that followed Samuel's speech in court now echoed throughout the country, demanding a response. The turnaround happened on a Wednesday morning. A guard, with a different expression than usual, almost respectful, called Samuel's name. He was taken not to an interrogation room but to the unit director's office. There his lawyer Sarah was waiting for him. Her face, once marked by weariness and skepticism, had a glow of disbelief. "Samuel," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "a miracle has happened. You need to see this." She turned her laptop screen towards him. For the first time he saw the video. He saw himself, on his knees, with a peace he didn't even remember feeling. He saw the truculence of the police in a new light. And then she showed him the headlines, the articles, the photos of the protests. People of all colors and creeds holding signs with his face and the phrase, "Praying is not a crime." Silent tears began to roll down Samuel's face. They were not tears of sadness, but of a deep and overwhelming awe. While he was isolated, thinking he was fighting alone, God was mobilizing an army of anonymous people in his favor. He saw the face of the journalist Maria on the screen and felt an immense gratitude for this stranger who chose to fight for him. He understood in that moment that his prayer in the square had not been interrupted. It had just continued in another form, echoing in the hearts of millions of people. The humiliation he felt being filmed had turned into the proof of his innocence. God had turned his greatest shame into his greatest vindication. A few days later, he was taken back to the same courthouse. But this time, the scene was completely different. The room was packed with journalists, activists, and members of his church community, including Pastor Jonas and Javier, who smiled at him with tear-filled eyes. In front of the courthouse, a crowd had gathered in support. The prosecutor, who was once arrogant, now seemed shrunken and uncomfortable. The judge entered the room with a solemnity that did not exist at the first hearing. The atmosphere was no longer one of condemnation, but of reparation. Samuel sat in the same place, but he no longer felt small. He felt the strength of every prayer, of every person who was outraged on his behalf. The judge banged the gavel, but the sound was soft, almost reverent. "Based on new evidence that has come to light and a full review of the case," he began, looking directly at Samuel, "the court orders the dismissal of all charges against Mr. Samuel Santos. The request for deportation is denied and dismissed." A wave of applause and sighs of relief filled the room. The judge continued, his voice heavy with an unusual weight. "This court also recommends that the police department review its protocols and that the City Hall reevaluate the municipal ordinance used as the basis for the arrest. What happened in this city does not reflect the values we uphold. It was a complete, overwhelming victory. The justice of men, pressured by divine justice, had finally bowed. Upon leaving the courthouse, Samuel was greeted as a hero. The flash of the cameras, which once recorded his humiliation, now celebrated his freedom. But he did not linger there. His first gesture was to hug Pastor Jonas and the brethren from his church. "It was your faith," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "It was your prayers that sustained me." At that moment, he was not a media celebrity. He was just a brother thanking his spiritual family. A powerful civil rights organization, which had taken his case pro bono after the public outcry, was already working behind the scenes. They not only secured his freedom, but also expedited the regularization of his status, opening a clear path to his permanent residency. In the following weeks, the change was profound. The City Hall, under intense pressure, officially repealed the old and discriminatory ordinance. The 2 police officers involved in Samuel's arrest were placed on administrative duty and subjected to a retraining program. The citizen who made the false report was identified and faced prosecution for false testimony, a consequence no one expected. God not only delivered Samuel, but also held accountable everyone who participated in that injustice in a precise and surgical way that only he knows how. Divine justice manifested itself in the details, restoring the honor of the one who was humiliated and exposing the darkness of those who acted with malice. When Samuel returned to his job at Liberty Square, he was no longer an invisible man. The people who used to pass by him without noticing now greeted him with smiles. Some stopped to shake his hand, to say they had prayed for him. Others, more shy, just nodded their heads in a gesture of respect. One day, a young woman approached him while he was tending a rose bed and in a low voice asked, "Could you pray for me? I'm going through a difficult time." Samuel stopped what he was doing, looked at her with the same serenity as always, and there in the middle of the square, he prayed for that stranger. His faith, once a reason for punishment, had become a source of comfort for others. The greatest miracle, however, was yet to come. With his legal status finally secured and the help of his new support network, Samuel achieved what had seemed impossible, bringing his 2 teenage sons from Luanda to live with him. The reunion at the airport was a moment of pure emotion, a scene of tears and hugs that sealed the end of his long journey of sacrifice. Seeing his sons' faces now by his side, he knew that every trial, every tear, every prayer in the dark had been worth it. The dream that was almost destroyed by injustice was rebuilt, stronger and more beautiful than before by the hand of God. He never lost his humility. He continued to be the gardener of Liberty Square, caring for the land with the same dedication. But something had changed forever. The square was no longer just his workplace, it was his testimony. Every flower he planted was a reminder of the beauty that can be born from pain. Every time he knelt under the same tree for his midday prayer, there was no more fear, only gratitude. He no longer needed to hide. His communion with God, once a private act, had become a silent beacon of hope and resilience for anyone who cared to see. Samuel's story became a legend in the city, a powerful reminder that faith is not something to be hidden, but to be lived. He never sought the spotlight, but his story continued to inspire. His small church grew, welcoming people from all corners who were touched by his testimony. He became a deacon, and his gentle voice, which once spoke the truth to a skeptical judge, now brought comfort and wisdom to his congregation each week. He taught by example, showing that true strength is not in power, wealth, or status, but in the stillness of a heart that trusts in God. From time to time, he would re-watch the video that changed his life. He no longer saw the humiliation. He saw the hand of God in every frame. He saw how the Lord used the technology of men to expose the truth, how he used the outrage of strangers to move a system, how he turned an act of hatred into an avalanche of love. He would smile with a deep peace, realizing that even at the lowest point of his life, when he felt weakest and most abandoned, he was, in fact, at the center of an extraordinary miracle that was just beginning to unfold. The man who reported him ended up losing his job and moved out of the city, unable to cope with the social ostracism that followed his exposure. The police officers were transferred to bureaucratic roles, away from the public, their careers forever marked by that act of prejudice. The justice of God, often silent and patient, had acted definitively, not with revenge, but with consequences. Every piece on the board was moved to its proper place, restoring the honor of the one who was humiliated and exposing the darkness of the one who acted with malice. The scales, finally, were balanced. Today, when Samuel walks through Liberty Square with his sons, he points to the tree where it all happened. He doesn't tell a story of pain, but a story of faith. He shows them that even when the world seems to be falling apart, there is a greater power working behind the scenes. He teaches them that the prayer of a righteous man can, in fact, move mountains, or, in this case, change the law of a country. His life became living proof that vulnerability, when surrendered to God, is transformed into an invincible force. Samuel's story is a testimony that will never be forgotten, a reminder that faith is not an escape from reality, but the strength that allows us to face and transform it. That day, when the system tried to silence his prayer, little did they know they were only amplifying it for the whole world to hear. The proof that even in the largest of metropolises, amidst the noise and indifference, the whisper of a conversation with God can be more powerful than any human law or decree. In the end, It was not the cry of injustice that prevailed, but the silence of a prayer. Because the strength that comes from your knees is greater than any power that tries to bring you down. If you know someone who needs their faith strengthened, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about how faith in God can move mountains. Thank you for listening.